friends and guests, if I asked the audience what was the first capital of the state of Ohio, I bet 95% of you would know that. And if I asked you what the capital of Ohio is now, you'd all know that. But you're going to learn a lot more in the next few minutes about how that all came about. Our speaker today is Mike Frush. He is the president of the Columbus Historical Society, and I must admit I did not know that there was a Columbus Historical Society until recently. He helped found the organization in 1990. He's the treasurer of the Columbus Landmarks Foundation, and he has some very interesting collection of memorabilia. So, in his professional life, he's a certified public accountant, president of Frush and Associates, located in the Brewery District. So, be prepared. You're going to learn more in the next 25 minutes than you did in your middle school Ohio history class. So, please welcome Mike Frush.
Good afternoon. I am treasurer of Columbus Landmarks Foundation. I am president of the Columbus Historical Society, so clear that up a little bit. And yes, I am a CPA whose hobby is history. My wife jokingly calls me Mr. Excitement. She doesn't have a whole lot to say about it because she's also a CPA. Turns out our son's a CPA, and my wife's brother is a CPA. Talk about exciting dinner conversations. Okay, today I'm going to take you on a journey, a quick journey, from prehistoric times to around 1842. Don't fall asleep, it's a fast ride on this journey. Columbus is a created city. And what I mean by that is most towns or cities exist and then become the capitals of their states. Columbus did not exist until it was specifically created to be the capital of Ohio. And we'll see that in a minute. Okay. 500 million years ago, where you're sitting looked like this. We were under a shallow sea and south of the equator. Then gradually, as the continents formed and shifted, 220 million to 200 to 175 million years ago, we ended up where we are today, which brings us into the dinosaur age and the searing question: were there dinosaurs in Columbus? And the answer is a definitive, we think so. The issue is, land dinosaur fossils have never been found in Ohio. They've been found in surrounding states. Now, don't confuse dinosaurs with megafauna, which is the mastodons, woolly mammoths, etc. This is dinosaurs. Dinosaurs fossils have not been found in Ohio, so obviously not in Columbus, but they've been found in surrounding states. So we really think there were dinosaurs in Ohio and Columbus, but we don't have proof of that. And it has to do with the erosion of the soil and et cetera. What we do have in Ohio and in Franklin County is fossils of the sea creature from the dinosaur age, and that's called the Dunkleosteous or Dunkleosteous. And it was ferocious enough to actually devour sharks. It was a very ferocious fish. If you want to see the head of one of these recreated, High Banks Park has one, and also Orton Hall at Ohio State University has one. And as a side comment, the Accounting Hall of Fame is at Ohio State University also. Don't miss that site. Anyways, that brings us to about 14,000 years ago, really jumping ahead. The glacier period. And the glaciers started receding, the last great glacier, the Wisconsin Glacier, started receding about 14,000 years ago. So that, obviously, the megafauna came in following the receding glacier. The woolly mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, even horses at that time. And obviously, when animals came, the first humans in Ohio came. And we date that about 11,500 years ago, plus or minus. And we believe the first humans in Ohio and in Columbus were of the Clovis culture. And Clovis people are known by the type of points or spearheads that they used then. Very distinctive. And these are only found in the Americas. They're not found worldwide. So we know they were created here supposedly by the Clovis people. We could get into that big discussion of were they really the first or were they not the first. We'll pass on that today. Other prehistoric cultures from the Paleoarchaic woodland cultures, Glacial Cave, Medina, Hopewell, Fort Ancient. You've seen these sites around the state. All these prehistoric peoples were actually in what is now Columbus from time to time. Then the historic native peoples, what's interesting to me is mid-1600s to 1720, there was a distinct absence of native peoples from Ohio. The main reason for that, we believe, is that the Iroquois nation came from the east and wiped out the Erie nation along the banks of the Erie, Lake Erie, what is now Lake Erie. So, and we think that a lot of the native peoples fled the area because of the Erie, or the Iroquois nation coming in. In Columbus, we were on that Scioto Indian Trail to the Ohio River, so we had a lot of traffic from native peoples. Mingo Town, Greenlawn Avenue, the Wyandotte, Shawnees, Delawares, all in Columbus area. 1774, there was that attack by Colonel William Crawford on this island back here that was at that time, or one time, called Bloody Island. There was an attack on the native peoples, and as we all know, William Crawford suffered for that later at the stake. Mingos and Wyandottes gave up their villages in the 1795 treaty. In the mid to late 1780s, there were a number of land ordinances passed by Congress establishing settlement patterns in what is now Ohio. And at that time, they created the Northwest Territory with the first permanent settlement at Marietta. There's kind of the division of some of the land ordinances. Not trying to race through this, but it's normally an hour or so presentation, trying to cut it down to 20 to 30 minutes for you. So a lot of land ordinances separating the different settlement areas in Ohio. The first settlement was across from Fort Harmar, and that was called Marietta. And Marietta was just like this, a simple blockhouse initially. It was the first permanent settlement in the Northwest Territory. Then Rufus Putnam, who was one of the founders of what was called the Ohio Company, settling Marietta. Here's a document in my personal collection, and it's back there on the table if you want to see it. Filled out and signed by Rufus Putnam in 1787, actually selling an interest in the Ohio Company settlement at Marietta to a Dr. Sprague. And I guess there are a lot of Spragues in that area of the state still, descendants of Dr. Sprague. Here is a 1790, even past that, 1790 map in my collection of the different native peoples' tribes in what is now the United States, 1790s. And you can see the Miamis, et cetera, in what is now the Ohio, the Six Nations, et cetera. So there was still a number of native peoples there. In 1795, the Treaty of Greenville kind of settled for a little while the conflict with the pioneers coming into Ohio, but it wasn't fully settled really until the end of the War of 1812. 1790s, there's this guy, Lucas Sullivant. Lucas Sullivant was a surveyor for the Virginia Military District, and he was mostly around Central Ohio. He decided he wanted to found a town his own town. So he had 3 sites that he was looking at. One was at where Dublin Road intersects State Route 42, up north of the zoo, way up north of the zoo. He was going to call that town Sullivant after himself. The second one was North Liberty. I happen to have a document of a sale of a lot in North Liberty, and eventually I'll donate it to the city that's now there. Anybody know what city is there now? Plain City. Plain City is now where North Liberty was supposed to be. But obviously Sullivant passed on those 2 sites, and he founded a town called Franklinton. And Franklinton was the first permanent settlement in central Ohio. 1797, located at the intersection of Scioto and the Whetstone rivers. At that time, the Olentangy was called the Whetstone. That was named for Benjamin Franklin. Here is the original Plat Map that Lucas Sullivant carried around in his pocket. COSI currently owns that. We'd love to borrow that from them for some exhibits we're going to be doing on the early history of Columbus. So we have borrowed it in the past. But he actually carried that around in his pocket. Here's a sale of a lot document signed by Lucas Sullivant. We'll see down here, it's also signed by John Kerr. His name will come up in a minute. But 1798 was a sale of a lot in Franklinton. Ohio was established then in 1803. And notice where the northern border is of Franklin County, Lake Erie. When Franklin County was first established, it went all the way to Lake Erie. Shortly after that, even in 1803, other counties were carved out of Franklin County. But if you're looking for really, really early history of the northern part of the state up in there, you may have to go to Franklin County records for that. So, 1803, Ohio was established. The Constitution of Ohio had an unusual provision in it, and that was that it required the state capital to be at Chillicothe for 5 years. 5 years, Chillicothe. So there's an image or a drawing, if you will, of the first state capital in Chillicothe. Then, so 1803, 5 years, 1808 comes on. There was feeling among the legislature that they would like to move. Zanesville, Ohio, quickly built a big building for them. There's an image of the building they built for them. The legislature felt they had to move to Zanesville since they built this building for them. So they moved there 1810 or so, roughly, for the 10, 11, 11, 12 sessions of the legislature. Almost immediately, they decided they didn't want to be in Zanesville. Not downgrading Zanesville. But at that time, it wasn't really in the center of the state. So they set up a commission in February of 1810 to determine the permanent site for the state capitol. There's the building in Zanesville today. These different entities applied to be the state capital of Ohio at that time. Delaware, Dublin, the East Bank of Scioto opposite Franklinton, we'll talk about that in a minute. Lancaster, Mount Vernon, Newark, Pickaway, Plains, and Worthington. All those entities actually wanted to be the state capital. The commission that was set up signed a document September 12, 1810, and then presented it to the legislature December 11, 1810, that they recommended this piece of land owned by John and Peter Sells, which is today Dublin, Ohio. So the commission actually recommended what became Dublin, Ohio, as the state capital. And to this day, there are people in Dublin saying, you guys stole our capital from us. And people from Delaware as well. I've heard that from them also. But for some reason, the state legislature didn't act on it. Then in early 1812, they reviewed all of these proposals again and decided on accepting a proposal from 4 businessmen from Franklinton. And their names were Starling, Johnston, McLaughlin, and Kerr, that John Kerr we saw signing Lucas Sullivant's thing. They were all backed financially by Lucas Sullivant. A lot of times you don't see that in the history books, but they were. So on February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1812, the state legislature accepted that proposal from those 4 businessmen. Now, the 4 people signed the agreement February 19th, 1812, their partnership agreement. The first, that east side of the river opposite Franklinton was just land. I mean, there might have been a couple settlers there, but that was about it. It was actually called by the pioneers in Franklinton at that time Wolf's Ridge. And it was called Wolf's Ridge because there were wolves that lived on that ridge. And periodically, the pioneers in Franklinton would cross the river. They'd get tired of hearing the howling at night. They'd cross the river, shoot the wolves, or chase them away. A month later, they'd be back. But it's still called Wolf's Ridge. Then, on June 18th, 1812, the first lots were offered for sale in Columbus. June 18th, 1812. Unfortunately, that was the same day that the United States declared war on Great Britain that came to be known as the War of 1812. And Franklinton was a big part of that war. A lot of people don't realize that, and it's not in a lot of the history books. William Henry Harrison, who this is a picture of, and I have a document back there you'll see in a minute, signed by him. William Henry Harrison was commander of the Army of the Northwest during the War of 1812. One of his headquarters was in Franklinton, and he used it as a gathering point for a lot of troops, for marching over to Mississinewa, for the Battle of Mississinewa, for the meeting with the native peoples, Indian chiefs, 35 Indian chiefs, trying to get them on their side during the War of 1812. It all happened in Franklinton, which is now part of Columbus. So Harrison. This was a log cabin that supposedly was used by him or some of his people. The Harrison House in Columbus has somewhat of a connection with Harrison and his troops. We're not officially sure that it was used by Harrison as his headquarters. We do believe it was used somehow by him or his troops. Here's a document from 1812, December 4th, 1812, authorizing someone to ride express from Delaware to Zanesville and back, $3 a day, and then also a trunk of public papers from Delaware to Franklinton. And it's signed on the back by William Henry Harrison. Harrison is the rarest signature as President of the United States. And the reason for that is he caught pneumonia at his inauguration and died 30 days later. So he's only president for 30 days. So if you ever see a document signed by Harrison as president, it's extremely rare, extremely rare. Then, backtrack here a minute. Okay, so in December 10th, 1816, what today is Columbus became the borough of Columbus. Now, in 2012, we celebrated the bicentennial of Columbus. I submit to you it could have also been celebrated in 2016, because that's when we officially became the borough of Columbus, was February 10th, 1816. The state legislature moved to Columbus in October 1816, and this was the buildings that were created by those 4 businessmen from Franklinton. They pledged to the state 10 acres of land for a state house and 10 acres of land for a penitentiary. So this was the actual buildings that they erected for the state legislature. The legislative offices were in the building on the left. The actual sessions were held. The State House was a building on the right. There was a third building that's not in this image, and that was for the United States courts that were also held here in Columbus, starting in 1816. The first session of state legislature was held here in December of 1816. So following it back, one thing I didn't mention was capital was in Chillicothe, went to Zanesville. While they were building Columbus, it moved back to Chillicothe and then to Columbus. So there were really 4 capitals of Ohio. Columbus is the 4th capital of Ohio. 2 of them happen to be at the same location in Chillicothe. So, now, one of the problems with the proposal from the 4 businessmen from Franklinton was that they said in the agreement that it would be the permanent capital of Ohio. Some of the legislators didn't like that. So they submitted a second proposal that said that the state will agree to have it as the capital at least until 1840. Okay. So in 1840, the state appointed a committee to decide where the permanent capital should be. So there was much confusion about the original 2 proposals from the people from Franklinton, and the committee couldn't decide which one was really the correct agreement that the state entered into with the 4 businessmen from Franklinton. So eventually, the legislators later said, forget it, this is our permanent capital. So we really, until 1842-43 session, we weren't the permanent capital until the legislators finally said, yes, we're going to stay here permanently. So that's kind of the quick version of how Columbus became the capital of Ohio. So, questions? One thing I will mention before I answer questions, and that is I am an amateur historian, so I may not be able to answer all your questions. So.
Why did they bail on Chillicothe?
They didn't think it was right in the center of the state. They felt it should be more in the center because you had Cleveland, back in the old spelling, Cleveland, but Cleveland, and they didn't feel it was right in the center of the state. So, yes, sir.
Why did William Tecumseh Sherman's mother think it was a good idea to name her son the middle name of an Indian chief?
That I wouldn't have a clue. That's a good question. Was William Tecumseh Sherman named with middle name Tecumseh? And I honestly don't know that. The Sherman family, I think, is an interesting story in that everybody remembers William Tecumseh Sherman, but his brother probably did as much for the overall development of this country as he did, John Sherman. John served in Congress for like 40 years, including Secretary of State under McKinley. And when the issue came up of maybe annexing Cuba, he was opposed to McKinley's position on that. But anyways, getting aside, John Sherman was very important to this state as well as William Tecumseh Sherman. Yes, sir.
Who designed the State House and when was it started?
Who designed it? Boy, that's a good question. I'd have to get back to you on that. I know the gentleman that gave the name to Columbus was Joseph Foos, who was a tavern owner here in Columbus. The actual designer of the State House, I'm not sure. Joel Wright was the actual surveyor that laid out the town of Columbus. Does anybody know who the designer was of the State House? Yeah, that's a good question, though. Yes, ma'am.
So the original 10 acres that were designated for the State House and the original 10 acres for the penitentiary, are they?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
The original 10 acres for the State House and the 10 acres for the penitentiary, are those still the same areas that the State House is at now?
The penitentiary was located, I believe, further southwest a little bit. Keep hitting this thing. Of the State House at that time, I believe. One interesting story about the State House that I heard was that when it was first built, there were certain odors emanating in the State House. And they found out that the restrooms weren't really draining to any place. So that was a horrible situation, I'm sure. Eventually they corrected that, but that was an early story that I heard about the State House.
My question is, as we downsize and clean out our attics and our basements, what kind of documents would interest you?
Well, that's a great question. The Columbus Historical Society is always looking for Columbus history. Photos that are identified. Unfortunately, occasionally somebody sends us a bunch of photos of people with no names on them. I mean, it's really hard to use those. But if you have documents relating to history that you have a question about, don't throw them away. Come and talk to us. We're at 719 West Town Street temporarily. We did sign a contract last week to purchase the Engine House number 6 property on Broad Street, which used to be Jimmy Ray Electronics on Broad Street. We have 145 days to raise the money to buy it, but we hopefully will be moving into that building in a partnership with Heritage Ohio. We are partners in that project. So, but as far as documents goes, I mean, look at the content, look at the signatures, and see who signed them. If it's somebody of local importance or regional or national importance, whatever, we'd love to talk to you about that. And if it's something that you want to keep long term, but yet you would let us copy, that would be great too. We have an active archives committee, and it's amazing what people will occasionally drop off at our facility there. We had a large bronze statue that someone dropped off not too long ago. You name it, great photographs of early Ohio State football teams people have sent us from California. Dudley Fisher was a nationally syndicated cartoonist from Columbus. His daughter sent us a hand-colored cartoon of his from Florida. I mean, it's just, you don't know what you're going to get, but we have a very active archives committee, and we would love to always talk to you about that kind of stuff. Again, content is one thing, and then who signed it or who's involved in it is the other thing. on documents.
In your opinion, who is the most influential person to help the creation of Columbus?
Who's
People you went through, who's one of the greater influencers?
Lucas Sullivant in doing all this. He's the one that settled this area to begin with.
And where was he originally from?
He was originally from Virginia. He was a surveyor. His father died when he was young. He eventually was tutored by a neighbor, became a surveyor, and then he crossed the mountains and became a surveyor of the Virginia Military District. So,
Why did those 4 businessmen go to the East Bank rather than putting it in Franklinton?
flooding. Franklinton was prone to flooding. The East Bank was higher and not prone to flooding. So, and actually Lucas Sullivant laid out Franklinton once before he laid it out the second time. And he had to reconfigure the layout because of flooding in Franklinton. So.
In central Ohio, I think the Souda River was a division between the U.S. military lands, the Virginia military district, and the refugee lands.
Yes.
How were those parcels distributed? What caused the parcels to be distributed?
Well, there's all kinds of different things in Congress. That, you know, the Revolutionary War, Congress promised a lot of people a lot of things. And at the end of the war, they felt, typical, they felt that they had to honor some of those, I don't know if it's big enough to see it, but you can see there's the Virginia Military District, there's the Military District, there's, you know, the Western Reserve, there's all kinds of different parcels that Congress, and this was the United States Congress, had promised to people. And so Ohio was the first state carved out of the Northwest Territory. So they had to make provisions for these commitments somehow. And how it got to the sizes and the shapes, you know, is a big question, I think. It's really strange. But like the Virginia Military District, you know, went all the way up that way. Look at the shape of that. It followed the Scioto River, you can see, for quite a while. But then, and maybe it went over to the Miami River, I believe. So, and anybody know who Dayton, Ohio is named after? Jonathan Dayton. Jonathan Dayton was the youngest signer of the Constitution of the United States. I mention that because my favorite restaurant's in Dayton. So the Pine Club. Back in the back.
You touched on it earlier, but how did Columbus get its name?
How did Columbus get its name?
Columbus got its name again. This theory says that Joseph Foos, a tavern owner here in Columbus, suggested it to the legislature, and they actually adopted the name on February 21st, 1812. So it was Joseph Foos, and I think Foos went on and moved to Springfield, Ohio at one point. So, but Foos, I think, was the one that gave us the name Columbus. And, you know, you hear arguments for not using that name in the future. I mean, it is what it is at this point. You know, we certainly don't celebrate what happened to the native peoples because of Columbus's discovery of America. But one of the things that you will see is that there is a statue of Christopher Columbus on the Broad Street side of City Hall. And it's not there to celebrate what Columbus did to America. It's to celebrate our sister city relationship with Genoa, Italy. That's why it's there. Genoa, Italy gave us that statue in 1955. And as a matter of fact, if you look at this little flag I have here, that's a Genoa, Italy flag. They came this summer and with an entourage, and I was fortunate enough to be a part of that host group. But Columbus has 10 sister cities, by the way. Yeah.
Do you know where Engagement, Ohio is?
Where what is?
Engagement, Ohio?
Yeah, I've heard this before. Where is it?
Is this a joke?
Between Marion.
Well, you can tell us.
Halfway between Marion and
Dayton.
Dayton. Yeah. Okay, I've got one quick one for you, and then I'll take another question. Columbus police officer was going south on High Street, and he noticed a car full of little old ladies going really slow. So he pulled them over to see if something's wrong. He asked the driver, he said, "Is something wrong?" And she said, "Well, the sign said 23. And he said, "No, that's Route 23. The speed limit's 45. And she said, "Okay." And he looked in the back seat and noticed the ladies back there were shaking. And he said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "We just came off of Route 104. Oh, well.
Is it true that Tecumseh had leather lips and Indian chief and Dublin assassinated?
What about leather lips?
Did Tecumseh have him assassinated?
I think the history book says, yeah, probably, that he had him assassinated. That's a sad situation because, he was very workable as far as working with the pioneers and the people of that area, and was friendly to everybody, really, his own people and the people, settlers coming in. But it's speculated that he was, ordered to be killed by Tecumseh. But again, the other questions? Yes, sir.
What do you know about John Stewart, the missionary to the Wyandot Nation?
I also don't know much about that. Sorry, I can't answer that.
I have more an answer than a question. To the gentleman who asked why William Tecumseh Sherman was named after a Shawnee chief. And that has a tie to Chillicothe, too, because Thomas Worthington was the federal land agent for new settlers settling Ohio. And he very much liked Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a very educated Shawnee, and he was a natural leader. And he frequently visited the Worthingtons' home, which was called Adena, overlooking Chillicothe. And he even slept there some nights. And anyway, poor Tecumseh, he was such a leader of Indians, but he was always signing treaties, and then the treaties would be violated. So he ended up organizing the Indians in one last rebellion attempt against the white people, but of course he failed. So that's just another little bit of background of why Tecumseh was a revered name in early Ohio.
Thank you. Anything else? Well, I hope you learned a little bit. Thank you.
Mike, tell about the Historical Society. What do you have coming up?
Okay, Columbus Historical Society, has, there have been years that we've had 26 programs on different topics. Bob Hunter spoke last Tuesday on the battle, the history of the battle between Ohio State and Michigan. We cover all kinds of different topics. It's columbushistory.org. Just go to columbushistory.org. You can see all of our events coming up, what we're doing. Any questions about the Historical Society? Great, thank you.
Yes. Do your walking tours again?
We do occasional walking tours. The Columbus Landmarks Foundation does more walking tours than we do, but we occasionally do walking tours of different areas. We did Goodale Park. We've done different Franklinton. We've done lots of different areas. We also offer private bus tours. If anyone has a group that's interested in a bus tour, we have bus tours as well. But these are things that we'll be developing more once we get into our permanent location. Right now, we have an upcoming exhibit probably in February on the 1920s. We're calling it the not-so-roaring 1920s. But I also have a committee that is working on our first exhibit for the new building. And it's going to be the 70s explosion. And we're going to focus on the decade of the 1970s. And we have about 12 people on this committee that meet once a month. We're having a ball with this. Those that are old enough to relate to the 70s. We're doing a lot of music stuff, a lot of the history of what happened in Columbus, from the riots at Ohio State in 1970, in the spring of 70. A lot of people remember Kent State riots, but Columbus at Ohio State had riots in the spring of 70 also. You know, to Watergate, to the Vietnam War protests, to equal rights protests, to you name it, from the 70s. There was a lot happening in the 70s. So that'll be our opening exhibit in our new building. Watch for it. The 70s explosion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm sure everybody picked up at least one or two things, probably a lot more than that, new bits of information about Columbus history today. So thank you very much. And other than that, we're just going to go on and win the Big Ten championship this weekend.